Greetings. My name is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. This edition is a special as we're joined by Dr. Adelaide Sanford as we continue our conversation about her work, her life, and the legacy. Dr. Sanford, when we last spoke in our first segment, you talked about your work with setting the standard, coming in as administrator. First of all, not just you shared certain valuable lessons for educators to reflect upon, future principals to reflect upon, as well as tools in terms of how to engage and educate parents. Now I want to talk about some of those teachers and teachers who became leaders who came out of PS 21 in Brooklyn. What type of environment did you create that you felt inspired your staff to either decide to make that leap from the classroom into administrative? In some cases, we have someone at the helm. Talk to me about that.
Primarily, it was to validate the historical necessity of our being responsible for each other. So by having been a teacher and sometimes a student at Crispus Attucks School and developed value systems, they wanted to stay. They didn't want to leave. When I retired in 1985, there were 5 licensed principals there at 21, people that I had groomed, helped them to pass examinations, and they were comfortable. They liked being there and the feeling of being surrounded by people who cared about them and understood them, and particularly after they were able to develop positive relationships with parents. I wanted to mention something that's a pivotal factor in terms of working with parents. This one parent that was very difficult. And she finally told me, she said, when the former principal was here, I looked at that person and I felt, well, she's the principal. She's supposed to be the principal. And she said, this parent said, I didn't compare myself with her. But here you come. You look like me. You come from the same kind of background, the background of struggle and sacrifice. She says, and I feel that you will judge me and say, oh, here she is with 5 children in this school, never see a father. And I could feel her pain because she was thinking that because we were living under different circumstances at this time, that I would look down on her. And this is an issue that we have to recognize and understand, that because of the history of slavery and because of the lack of opportunity, there are many very talented, creative people who have enormous potential, but have not been able to realize it, and sometimes feel more comfortable when they are not confronted with other African Americans who have done well. For example, when I visited the prisons frequently, even before I became a regent. And when the president became a person of African ancestry, I was so enormously proud. And in talking to some of these beautiful, handsome, brilliant prisoners of African ancestry, were not so happy. And one of them told me, they said, well, I lost my excuse for what I didn't become. President Obama didn't have a father that nurtured him, and neither did this young man who was talking to me. He said, so I've lost my excuse. And I said, you don't need to feel that you've lost your excuse, because somewhere along the way, he had opportunities, privileges that perhaps you didn't have. Your responsibility now is to use what you have. Take advantage of every opportunity that you have to get your GED. And many did. They went on and took courses, college courses, while they were in prison, because they were able to remove that feeling. So we have to understand that we have a special burden when you get to a level of achievement that the world will call success. You have to realize that there are many other people of African ancestry who had potential but didn't have opportunity. And we have to embrace them, love them. I speak almost every other day to some person who was a parent when I was a principal. I keep in touch with them. That person who told me that she felt that I would compare my life and her life became my greatest supporter. Once she understood that I did not judge her or the course of her life, that I wanted the best for her children just as she did, and together we could make that happen. And so I think that we have to always keep that humility in mind, because sometimes when you go into a situation that's difficult, people of African ancestry, and I'm not a person of color. I only have one color, that's black. And so I say, when you talk to a person of African ancestry, you have to understand all of the psychological damage that has been done to them and what it has impacted on their feeling of worth, and help them. And we had many parents who did become paraprofessionals. They went on. 3 or 4 of them became teachers. They had the potential. I can't inspire potential. I can recognize it, but the potential is there, and we have to believe in that. Now, similarly, with the people who got comfortable with their 5 principles, I said, no, you've got to get out there. A boat doesn't function until it gets in the water. You cannot just sit at the dock and look beautiful. It has to get out in the deep water.
So you, as you mentioned, not only were you inspirational to get those who had the potential in the school to become leaders on their own, and but also the parents, and that's powerful. Let's talk about recently. Well, let me go back. You later, when you left education, well, not really left, but you left as being the administrator of 21. You were convinced, someone came to you to talk about becoming a regent. Talk to us about your experience as being a regent on New York State, Board of Regents for New York State. What were some of your experiences and so forth? And what did it teach you? What lessons?
At the time that Assemblyman Van approached me, I was at Harvard. I was visiting urban principal that they had ever had at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard. And I had been invited to come because they had a principal center at Harvard, and they had never had an urban principal at that center, and they were considering making it a full-time position rather than 2 people from higher ed doing it. So I said, no, I want to finish this, and I want to write about 21. So he told me to come to Dr. Clark's retirement party. So I did, Kenneth Clark. And Dr. Clark, when he made his closing remarks, he pulled out of his pocket a presentation that he had prepared. Usually the Board of Regents would give you something to say if you were going to go out to speak. But he pulled this out of his pocket and he said, look, I have been a failure as a regent. They call me the quiet giant, but the staff is less integrated than it was when I came. The children are just as much behind or more. The textbooks haven't changed. He said, I may be a quiet giant, but I have not been successful. Well, that touched me so deeply because this is a scholar. This is a brilliant, recognized international scholar. And he's saying that he has been a failure. And I thought to myself that perhaps it was because he was a higher education person. And we lose our children before they get to higher ed. And then when they get to higher ed, many of them are not retained. And I thought perhaps having worked from early childhood through the 12th grade, there were some insights in terms of what happens when the children are young, and maybe I could be helpful. So I left Harvard and I went back to New York, and I was fought tooth and nail by the union, but I was unanimously elected. Made it clear to me from that time by the other members of the Board of Regents that it would take me several years to find out how the regents worked, and in the meantime I should just be quiet and listen and learn what they do and try to do what they do. Now, they didn't say it in that many words, but that was the message. The message was in words that you ought to be quiet and listen and learn what we do. And that was absolutely impossible. I had no intention of doing that. So from the beginning, it was a struggle. It was a struggle to have a voice. After a while, they began to say, when they found out that they could not keep me from speaking, they would say, okay, go ahead and say it and get it over. And I said, I don't wait to be called upon to speak, and it's not for you to determine when to get over. So it was a struggle. It was a struggle because they were there to maintain the educational system which they felt was successful. So it was for me to point out to them that if you have an educational system that is diverse, and I could quote the number of people of the ethnic groups, and you only have one group that's successful, you don't have a successful system. So we have to stop talking about failing children and talk about failing schools. It took 4 years to just get the change in that phraseology from failing children to failing schools, because during that time, the reading scores were in the New York Times when they came out, but didn't say anything about how many of the teachers were certified, were qualified in the subject that they're teaching, how many of them had any access to cultural information. Everything was placed on the children. So the notion of closing the achievement gap was a suggestion that if we say it is an opportunity gap, if we say it's a health gap, if we say it's a housing gap, if we say it's an employment gap, then we're blaming the system. And we can't do that. So we have to say achievement, because then that puts the onus on the children. So then it took a long struggle to move them past that point of failing students to failing schools. And that's when the low-performing schools vocabulary came into existence. And so we began to talk about low-performing schools. And I chaired the first committee on low-performing schools, not on failing students.
Very important. And I know that you served the Board of Regents from 1986 to 2006. At that time, as you made a choice to move on from the regents, I assume there was a need and there was a void, obviously. Recently, as of this year, we recently heard of the historic appointment of the first African American to be the chancellor of the Board of Regents, who was from PS 21, Dr. Lester Young. And it was something that is a long time in coming. Can you share with us your thinking when you heard that Dr. Young had become the first African American to become the chancellor for the New York State Board of Regents?
Well, he had been in constant touch with each other, as I have with all those 9 principals that we talked about and the 8 earned doctorates. So he was a part of my family, of the community. So when he called and told me that there would be a vote, he didn't know which way it would go because we understand how things are. But there was a possibility. So from that time on until that Monday, I was prayerful and eager. And when his wife called me and told me that it had happened unanimously, I was overjoyed for Dr. Young and his wife, both of whom earned their doctorates while they were at 21, and for the family of the children who now got the Adelaide L. Sanford Award because of my brother's keeper, and for all of the people who would be encouraged by the power of the struggle, the tenacity, all of those people who now understood that we are redefined as beloved. I call them my beloved. I call you my beloved because you have been called disadvantaged, culturally deprived, at risk, endangered species. And Carter G. Woodson taught us that if you want to control a person's thinking, you have to control what that person thinks about himself. And if you have only heard one side of the story, the disadvantaged, culturally deprived, and you have never been told that you are beloved and special and extraordinary and tenacious and worthy and capable, then you don't know it. So you have to be told that. And so I surround our people, wherever they are, to say, I want you to know who you really are. You identify yourself. That's a part of what we say at Kwanzaa, self-identification. I identify you as beloved, as special, as gifted. And I think that the struggle for me is not over. When I say for me, I mean me personally. Dr. Young is in the position as chancellor. It's historic. There is a black man who is vice chancellor. So we've got 3 black men on the Board of Regents, 2 of whom hold the top positions of chancellor and vice chancellor, and then a 3rd black man. You have a Hispanic woman who is the acting commissioner. This is a time for us not just to rejoice, but to reflect on how we made it where we are. And a part of the reason for the hysteria and the black backwash and the rioting is there is an understanding that the tide is changing. And there are many people who are threatened by that. But we have to approach it not with anger, not with name-calling, not with hurting each other. It pains me that we have to say Black Lives Matter to the world. But does it matter to us? Do Black lives matter to me personally? Does your life matter to me personally? And so I rejoice with Dr. Young and Renee and his parents and all of the people who know and love him, and thank him for what he has done, knowing that's yet to be seen what he will do.
I mean, I think you've hit it on the head in terms of the importance of this historic positioning that we are in, and particularly as relates to some of the events that are taking place at the time that we are meeting here in 2021 as we look at a new administration in the White House and the first woman of African ancestry and Asian ancestry, becoming the vice president, as well as the president, as well as just dealing with the tide of racism that also lifts its ugly head. As we reflect and move forward into the future, and this time that we're meeting is actually around the 92nd birthday, would have been the 92nd birthday of the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Looking at education as a civil right, what do you think that Dr. King would say if he were with us today in terms of just reflecting on the landscape, whether it be education, social, what would you think?
When you look at Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, there is a phrase there. He says, I have a dream that someday black children and white children will be able to join hands. Very often we overlook that. Will be able. He doesn't say they're going to join hands. You can't join hands while one sits at the table and one's back in the kitchen. Where are the enablers? That's what I'm sure he would want to know. Are we an enabler so that this dream can come to fruition? It will not be automatic. It will not just happen. We are enablers. Dr. Young is an enabler. I hope I try to be an enabler. So when we look at that dream speech, always look at that phrase, will be able. It's profoundly important to understand. Trump gave enabling powers to those people who believe what he believes. He enabled them to do what they did. They said it. We're following his directions. So there has to be an enabler. And I think that Dr. King would be challenging us today to be enablers.
And when we talk about the fact that as you have in your time with the department, and you basically used your to enable others in terms of to see their potential, whether it be a parent who looks at the opportunity that you represent and realizes that they had to look within themselves to see that there was another opportunity they didn't even look at, or there was an educator sitting in a classroom that had the potential to become a leader who needed to step out. For those sitting in the audience who need to think about becoming that enabler and understanding that we all have various talents, we all have various skills, that we have to become able, what would you say to that person who needs to understand their role in enabling not just themselves to become successful, but also the child that might be in that in their home, or the child that might be in a classroom? How do we impact, what do you call it? How do we unleash that enabler within ourselves to enable others? That's what I'm saying.
If you know the history and you live that history, you will understand that if you are in a position to be an enabler and you don't function in that way, you're already dead. You may not be dead from drugs or alcohol or other abuse, but you're dead because you're not functioning. So we have to help those young people to hear the voice, not just once, repetitively. You know, we talk about remediation for students. Sports people are very, very much smarter than educators because they can get youngsters to go in there and practice basketball, baseball, football. They never call them taking a course because they're retarded. When we do staff development, we don't call it remediation. So we have to get ourselves into the position of understanding that you have the potential to be an enabler every day. No big deal. How many times have we seen children doing the wrong thing and we stretch out to correct them or to let them know that we care? You're so beautiful. Why aren't your words as beautiful as you are? We have to help them to understand. That's being an enabler, so that you provide the opportunity for a person to know, you can come to me. Lucian said to me today, and it was very meaningful, tell me what you need. Say that to anybody. Tell me what you need. How can I make it possible for you to be able to do that? That's why I have this cane. This cane helps me to walk. It's an enabler for me. And I think that we have the capacity. We just have to understand that if we're not functioning as enabler, forget about all this rhetoric about I have a dream, and forget about all this talk about the principles of Kwanzaa while we spend our money elsewhere. You are not an enabler. Think deeply about what it means to be human, what it means to sacrifice. You won't be paid to go to freedom. That was one of the things that kept most people from saying, no, I would never be a regent, because there's no salary. In addition to not having a salary, before I became a regent, I could serve as a consultant to schools, to school districts, to colleges, to universities. Not as a regent. I had to stop everything that I did that earned money for me when I became a regent. If I had been a professor in a school, that's okay. But if I had been writing books, I could not be a regent. Now, that's a sacrifice, because my husband and I decided that the 2 years that I said I was going to stay, I would go up without that income. Sometimes we have to realize that sacrifice is necessary. I used to ask my grandmother, my grandparents, whose picture you might see in there, were enslaved people. Enslaved people. Somebody enslaved them. Use that term with children. And when you talk about enslavement, always talk about resistance. I used to ask my grandmother, why did she try to live? Why didn't she run? Why didn't she spit in the soup? All the things that a child would ask when they don't understand. And my grandmother, very patient, and if you look at her picture, you will see the genetic agony still etched on her face, the separations, the humiliations, the isolation, the loss of name, the loss of language, the loss of God worship, having God substituted to look like the oppressor and call him Jesus. She would answer to me, I lived for what I hoped you would be, what you would do, what you would say, where you would go, what you would endure. She was challenging me to be an enabler, even though she didn't use those words. And at 95, I get weary. There were many, many times during the time that I was a principal and being charged by the union for atrocities, being told I would never go beyond being a teacher, and I became the principal of that school. When I think about that, I think about my grandmother. And I ask myself, is this what you meant for me? When I went to the inauguration, both of them, when I walked across the bridge beside President Obama, when I became Vice Chancellor of the Board of Regents, when I heard about Lester becoming the Chancellor, I know that this is what my grandmother meant. And I try to keep that in mind. Without an understanding of the future, not having a husband not having a language, not having a name of her own, not having anything that belonged to her, never being able to go home, never knowing where home was. How dared she have the courage to project the enabler mandate to me? And when I get weary, and I do, I ask myself, Grandma, talk to me. Is this what you hoped for me? Have I lived up to it? Am I trying? Will you stay with me? Will you keep your words alive in my heart and mind, that I can transfer them to my children and my grandchildren? Grandma, are you with me?
Dr. Sanford, I think everyone on the other side of the tube actually was asking that question as they looked in your eye and felt the power of your words. And as you have throughout our sojourn, you have been the reminder, you have reminded us about, even as we deal with one of the most challenging times, which is a major pandemic, which many people, some of our people have not been able to stay with us. But as we as a people deal with this, what it seems to be a big challenge, what would you say for those as we weather this experience? And then the message to the children, those children who are sitting out there who perhaps don't understand the power of education, the importance of reflecting on history as you have when you founded the Board of Education for People of African Ancestry, when you developed the Clark House along with several others, the work that you've done and the commitment to our history. So I just ask that you reflect on that as you speak to the children in the audience. And I know we're talking about children of all ages right now.
The children and responsibility for children is an Africanism. It is a core value in African culture. When we speak about culture, sometimes we think about music and art, but culture is a code of belief, is a value system. And in the traditional African value system, responsibility for the children is primary. Responsibility for the elders is primary. In indigenous African people, they didn't have orphanages. People took other people's children. And when we came out of slavery, many people did the same thing. They took other people's children, whether it was their family or not. They didn't put children under a social service system. So I would say to the children who are listening, you are very important. There are generations of people who have made it possible for us to know you, to love you, to teach you, to embrace you. We know that education is more than schooling. And so we know that other people of African ancestry that come in contact with you are also teaching you. They're teaching you by the example of caring about you and sharing you. It's a dangerous time. The years that we spent as enslaved people was a difficult time. We didn't have a virus, but we were ruled by cruel and inhumane circumstances. Very rarely did a person who was enslaved live beyond the age of 26, 27, 28 because of the conditions under which they lived. And they weren't valued. Today, to have lived to be 95 puts a responsibility on me to remind us of the importance of the children, of embracing the children, other people's children. I have loved other people's children as well as my own. And to know that that love is non-negotiable. It doesn't depend upon whether you have a high reading score or whether you go to college or whether you graduate from high school. It's not dependent upon any of that. It is non-negotiable. So I would tell the children that we embrace you physically. Now we may not be able to, but we embrace you spiritually and emotionally, and you are valuable. This is a pandemic. We don't know what will come out of it, but we do know that for generations there have been different kinds of diseases that have attacked people: smallpox, Black Plague, and usually, as far as we know, it was not worldwide as it is now. Now, the communication system is better today than it was years ago. It may have been wider than we know, but don't be afraid of the future. If a vaccine is made available, I certainly suggest that you take it, just as we do with the smallpox and diphtheria and the others. I know we have an apprehension because of the government programs at Tuskegee and because of the book, Medical Apartheid. We know that we have been used experimentally and mistreated physically, but we have survived. We are the only people that have survived as many years of brutal treatment, rape, beatings, castration, mutilization, not just of our minds and our bodies, but of our very spirit. But we have survived. There are some people who will survive. Everybody who gets the virus doesn't die. If you look at the comparison between those who are hospitalized and those who are sick and those who will die, everybody doesn't die. Let's be determined that we won't be one of those that dies. We're going to see if we can stay to see it through. So wear the mask, wear the gloves, do what's necessary. If you have an opportunity to have the immunization, you do that. But at the same time, think of your body as the temple of God and take care of it, because there are many people that abuse their bodies, whether there's a pandemic or not. They are abusive to their bodies because of what they eat, what they don't eat, because of lack of exercise, just because of not valuing the Creator that God has done and made Himself the first ancestor. We are created in His image, whole and perfect.
Dr. Sanford, I just want to say that, we are honored to have the opportunity to speak to you as you reflect on a lifetime, 95 years on this earth. You've seen things that many of us have not. And you have also inspired generations of educators and others through your work, through your struggle, and through your lessons about life. And we can only hope to continue to pass the baton that you've passed on to all of us, to become an enabler, to become a beacon of life to someone out there, to do as you've done and continue to do. But I just want to say, on behalf of Cultural Caravan, I want to salute your work. I want to salute all that you do, and we can only hope to continue the work and to celebrate the legacy that you have stand upon, as you stand upon the shoulders of your ancestors, and as we stand upon your shoulders and move forward in that direction. So I just want to say thank you so much, and we continue to be inspired by your work, inspired by your lessons, and to continue to do the work that's put out. Thank you for joining us. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our broadcast, and we continue to encourage you to tune in, to write, and to tell a friend. But please visit our website at www.ccptv.org. But until next time, Louise Dente saying thank you.